Well, what an honor to be here and to be doing this in the New York Public Library. I see all libraries as sanctuaries of dissent. Well, Halloween is just around the corner, and the kids are going to be out in force saying trick or treat, right? Give me the candy, or, well, you may be subjected to a prank. But the pranksters are already out in force, as you just heard the story of the Yes Men, and it's not just the Yes Men. There is so much happening right now. For example, you may have heard that in the Indian Ocean, the president of the Maldives held the world's first underwater cabinet meeting last weekend, demonstrating that rising sea levels could very soon overwhelm his archipelago nation. When the Copenhagen Climate Conference is less than 50 days away, people are stepping up the pressure. The president of the Maldives is named Mohammed Nasheed. When he held this underwater news conference with his entire cabinet in scuba gear, well, I think two of the people did not go underwater because they didn't know how to scuba dive. It's a new requirement for politicians now. They signed an SOS from the front line declaration, reading in part, "If we can't save the Maldives today, you can't save the rest of the world tomorrow." They're carrying that declaration to Copenhagen. So that had just happened last weekend when we heard about the latest prank of the supreme pranksters, the Yes Men. Yes, that remarkable news conference in the National Press Club where they rented the press room and posed as representatives of the Chamber of Commerce. And, well, you heard about what they did in great detail. But it's really significant, I mean, to be doing it before reporters, but they're very much used to it, holding a legitimate press conference stating the Chamber's complete reversal in its historically adamant opposition to climate change legislation. So the day after they did this on Democracy Now!, how many of you listen to Democracy Now!? How many of you watch Democracy Now!? If you live in the city, you can watch it on CUNY TV every night, on Manhattan Neighborhood Network, and you can video and audio podcasts at democracynow.org. But we had the Yes Men on. We had Andy Bickelbaum on the next morning, showed it, and then he came on to talk about his prank. And afterwards, we had on a PR guy. We had on Jim Hogan, longtime PR man in Canada, who's just written a book called Climate Cover-Up. He's been doing PR for 30 years. And, you know, there's been a lot of comparisons of the Yes Men now to the balloon boy. You know, how are they any different? What about this hoax? What about these liars? And so I asked Jim Hogan, you know, he's a PR guy. This is his profession. This is who he mingles with. What does he think of what these guys did? And he was pretty straightforward on Democracy Now! He said the PR stunt wasn't pulled off by the Yes Men. The PR stunt is basically being pulled off by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and it's been going on for decades. Do you know how much they have been spending to affect climate change legislation? I should say to eviscerate, to stop any kind of climate change legislation. Oil, gas, and coal interests are spending $300,000 a day lobbying the government. Well, the moment of climate change truth is upon us, and the professional deniers are up to their old tricks. But thank God we've got some pranksters who are up to some new tricks. And it's not just... They were not just born this week, of course. The stories of the Yes Men go back. In 2004, in December, on the 20th anniversary of Bhopal, India, the disaster in which a Union Carbide plant gas leak killed thousands of people, Andy Bickelbaum of the Yes Men appeared on BBC News, posing as a representative of Dow Chemical, speaking from a French studio to the BBC broadcaster in London. His name was Jude Finisterre. Okay, end of the earth, Finisterre. But anyway, his name was Jude Finisterre, dead serious about this dead serious topic. You know, Dow Chemical had bought Union Carbide. By the way, they didn't go to BBC to ask to be on. BBC went to them, and this is how it happens. They set up a website, dowethics.com, and they got an email from BBC, would you be on this very important 20th anniversary? So they went into the studio as a Dow Chemical spokesperson, claiming Dow would finally take full responsibility for the accident. They had bought Union Carbide. They would liquidate Union Carbide and put the $12 billion, give it to the people of Bhopal. All of a sudden, you saw on BBC, breaking news, as they realized what this Dow Chemical spokesperson is saying. And, the hoax is revealed, and Dow Chemical is saying, you've got to take this back. BBC is taking back. The news has gone all over the world, and these guys don't stop. They also issue a press release, again as Dow, saying, okay, we do not apologize for what we did to the people of Bhopal. So let's advance a few years, if you could call it advancing. The Yes Men, Andy Bickelbaum and Mike Bonanno, addressed Canada's largest oil conference, posing as executives of ExxonMobil and the National Petroleum Council. They announced a plan to convert the corpses of the expected millions of victims of climate change into a fuel they call Vivolium. They're ejected, after which Bonanno holds a news conference and says, while ExxonMobil continues to post record profits, they use their money to persuade governments to do nothing about climate change. This is a crime against humanity. So it's picked up, of course, around the world, as was this news conference last week. Dow, that was picked up by BBC. The last week's press conference, as it's all unfolding at the National Press Club, Fox Business News is going live with the announcement, and then CNBC is going live, Reuters is going live. So their work is accomplished by the networks that don't ask the questions. A spokesperson for a corporation speaks, why question them? Of course, question the yes men unless you don't realize that they are the yes men. It is so important that we raise questions, and there's no better people to do it than all of you, than the artists and activists. I do a column every week to try to give a roadmap in the mainstream newspapers to people for alternative media, this universe of alternative ideas. And one of the first pieces I did was called The Art of War and Deception. And I started with a quote. Every great work of art goes through messy phases while it's in transition. A lump of clay can become a sculpture, blobs of paint become paintings which inspire. No, this is not Pablo Picasso speaking, but Major General William B. Caldwell IV, spokesman for the multinational force Iraq, comparing the carnage in Iraq to a work of art in another audacious attempt to paint Iraq as anything other than a catastrophe. The general's remarks do bring the great artist, Picasso, though, to mind. His epic painting, Guernica, named after the city in Spain, captured the brutality of the bombing of the city during the Civil War, the Spanish Civil War. The painting, almost 30 feet wide, globally recognized depiction and artistic condemnation of war. Picasso showing the terror on the faces of the people, the frightened animals. He shows the dead, the dying, the dismembered. A tapestry reproduction of the Guernica is up at the United Nations. It adorns the lobby outside the United Nations Security Council. I don't know how many of you knew this. And in February of 2003, before then U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell gave his major push for war at the United Nations, remember that speech that he would later call a blot on his record? A blue curtain was drawn across the tapestry so that the image would not be the backdrop for the press statements on the coming war. Immediately, posters and banners of Picasso's Guernica began appearing at the anti-war demonstrations that were sweeping the globe. The attempted control of imagery and propaganda, language and spin has been a high priority in the past for the Bush administration. Yes, the Pentagon forbade photographing the flag-draped coffins of fallen soldiers, but the manipulation goes beyond the war. And I should say, unfortunately, President Obama has continued to try to withhold certain pictures, in this case, pictures of torture. He should not be an accomplice to what the past president did. It is not the images that are so offensive. It is that the act was done. And if he decries the act, he should not be afraid to show, to reveal, to pull back the curtains on what has been such a terrific stain on all of our history. The only way to clean it up is to expose it and then to move forward. But let's go beyond the war. We go back to President Dwight Eisenhower, who once said, every gun that's made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies in the final sense a theft from those who hunger and are not fed. Well, if Eisenhower worked for the Bush administration, he would have had to revise his statement recently. They said when they were in office, they stopped using the words hunger or hungry when describing the millions of Americans who couldn't afford to eat. Instead of suffering from hunger, the Agriculture Department said these people were experiencing very low food security. Now, we got to tell things like they are. You know, I originally come from Pacifica Radio. Now Democracy Now! Is on 800 public radio and television stations, but we started at Pacifica. In New York, it's BAI. It's a 60-year-old network, begun when a man named Lou Hill in Berkeley, California, came out of the detention camps after World War II. He was a conscientious objector and said there's got to be a media outlet that is not run by corporations that profit from war, but run by journalists and artists. And that's how Pacifica was born. It grew to 5 stations, KPFK in Los Angeles, celebrating 50 years now, BAI in New York, about to be 50, Washington, WPFW, the youngest station, and KPFT in Houston, born in 1970. That station's the only radio station in the country, the Houston station, whose transmitter was blown up. In the first year of operation, they had just gone on the air, and the Ku Klux Klan strapped dynamite to the base of the transmitter and blew it to smithereens. And when they got back on their feet, they blew it up again. Now, the silver lining of this, of course, is Pacifica didn't have any money to advertise the new station. It certainly blew it into the consciousness of the potential listeners of Houston. And I can't remember if it was the Grand Dragon or the Exalted Cyclops, because I often confuse their titles. But he said it was his proudest act. And I think that's because he understood how dangerous Pacifica is, how dangerous independent media is. Dangerous because it allows people to speak for themselves. And when you hear someone speaking from their own experience, whether it's a Palestinian child or an Israeli grandmother, whether it's an uncle from Afghanistan or an aunt from Iraq, it rings true. You do not have to agree, but you begin to understand. It breaks down stereotypes that fuel the bigotry, that fuel these hate groups. We need a media in this country that builds bridges between communities, doesn't advocate the bombing of bridges. And that's the power of independent media. You know, I think the embedding process has brought the media to an all-time low. You know, reporters embedded in the front lines of troops in Iraq and Afghanistan. I'm not saying the reporters aren't brave, but think about what are they going to get when you're covering the war from the trigger end, when you're sleeping with the troops, eating with the troops, when your life is in their hands, you bring one perspective. If you're going to have these reporters embedded there, you need reporters embedded in Iraqi hospitals and Afghan communities and the peace movement around the world to get the full implications of war. And the problem is not only being embedded in the military, it's being embedded in the establishment in Washington. How often you have these reporters, whether it was the Bush administration or the Obama administration, going to the White House news conference, all too often enjoying the access of evil. That's access of evil, trading truth for access. It's got to stop. Because we are journalists, and there's a reason why our profession is the only one explicitly protected by the US Constitution, because we're supposed to be the check and balance on power. My brother and I wrote a book called Static, and the reason we call it that is because in this high-tech digital age, all we ever get in the media is static. That veil of distortion and lies and misrepresentations and half-truths that obscure reality. When we need the media to give us the dictionary definition of static, that's criticism, opposition, unwanted interference. We need a media that covers power, not covers for power. We need a media that is the fourth estate, not for the state. And we need a media that covers the movements that create static and make history. And I also think that's what artists do. Artists like Mike and Andy, artists who engage in, document what is happening in the world and reflect it back to us. How important that is. We need an honest, authentic media that's not brought to us by the war manufacturers, that's not brought to us by the food processors, the health insurance industry, that's not brought to us by the drug companies. We occupy a sacred space in society. And the reason we are protected and the reason we have to use that protection for social good. You know, I know artists here have done work in New Orleans. There was a very interesting example when Hurricane Katrina hit of the media doing the right thing. You know, the media embedded in the front lines of troops in Iraq. Well, when they went to New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina hit, something interesting happened. A side effect of President Bush, you know, not authorizing his administration to take care of the people, that we could see the drowning of an American city in this century is remarkable, this great cultural center. But a side effect of him doing nothing was that when the corporate media raced to New Orleans, there were no troops to embed with. And we suddenly saw an image that was unspun, reporters standing in the water. I remember a CNN reporter, a young woman, interviewing a man who was carrying his boy. He said his wife, her hand had just slipped out of his as she said, "Take care of our children." He turned around and walked off in shock with his child into the water, and the reporter started to cry. That's reporting from an unembedded perspective. That's reporting from ground zero. Could you imagine if for just 1 week we saw those images in Iraq and Afghanistan? We saw the babies dead on the ground. We saw the women with their legs blown off by cluster bombs. We saw the soldiers dead and dying. For just 1 week. Americans are a compassionate people. They would say, no, war is not the answer to conflict in the 21st century. Democracy Now!